I looked around the world at restaurants that were thinking differently, and I went to them, whether that was in England, the Fat Duck, whether that was in Copenhagen, Noma. I'm going to go around the world, and I'm going to go on this pilgrimage to all these places that are thinking differently, because thinking differently now at St. John's making me feel more whole. I was tapped into this mainstream consciousness that made me feel empty, and now I'm like feeling something. I'm starting to feel alive for the first time.
Welcome to The Slowdown, your time to define success and growth for yourself with a little inspiration from others. This week, we're back at Brazen Studios with chef and restaurateur Douglas McMaster. I'm always interested in hearing from people in different industries and what is a more fast-paced, physically grueling and emotionally battering world than that of the high-end Michelin Star kitchens. Douglas is the owner of Silo, the world's first zero-waste restaurant based in Hackney. He is a true trailblazer, and I hope you find this conversation as enlightening and enlivening as I did. I was traveling to Bucharest for my TEDx, and I realized as I got there that I'd forgotten my passport. And wow. I ended up having to sort of crumble into a crying mess at the BA counter. Wow. And there was no flight that day, but they were like, we'll get you on the flight first thing in the morning. You don't have to pay for a flight change. I had to go all the way back home to collect my passport, to then go all the way back to the airport to fly again. But I'd missed sound check, dress rehearsal, any kind of practice time. Wow. That I could have possibly had. Wow. So my first time ever out on any kind of stage to give any kind of public speaking was my TEDx in Bucharest in front of, there's 1,200 people. Wow. And the person who went just before me was this incredible guy who had lost his leg to cancer. Wow. And now works for Airbus in France and basically creates prosthesis for kids in developing countries who've lost their limbs. And I'm like, I'm talking about nothing in comparison to what this guy is talking about. So it was an interesting experience.
Yeah, right.
But not as good as yours.
Well, yeah.
For context, you were saying that your TEDx, you went to Vilnius and recorded the whole thing, and then at the end they said something was wrong with the cameras. We need you to, there was no audio. We need you to actually, after everybody is gone and you have no audience reaction, re-record your entire talk.
Even worse, they were like, sorry, you've lost it. But I'd spent 6 months writing the script.
Of course.
Thinking about it deeply, which I'd like to come back to that as one of the best things I've ever done for a lot of big reasons.
Same.
Including being on this podcast, being able to articulate something clearly. However, I'd been working on this TED Talk for 6 months, and then flown to Vilnius, took a week off of work, which when you run a business on your own, that's a huge thing to commit to. And then they told me, sorry, it's all for nothing. I was like, no chance. There's absolutely no chance I'm leaving this auditorium unless we refilm it and like get the audio and you can drop in loads of visuals of the crowd or whatever. And they were like, no, sorry, we can't do it. And I said, I'm not leaving until you re-record me saying that exact same thing on that stage. So I insisted that they would re-record it. And I then stood in front of maybe like 7 people rather than 700 people, the same spiel. And there was no like timer in it. So yeah, there was a lot of things that I'm frustrated about when I watched that, or not that I watch it anymore because it's too frustrating. But yeah, it was a bit of a disaster. But to go back to the more interesting kind of bigger point is, and I'm hoping that you might agree, is I remember the beginning of writing that script having just dribble, just so many pages of dribble, and I wanted to say everything, and I was so passionate about all these different pockets that were seemingly unconnected. And then, you have 18 minutes. So you just distill and distill and distill and distill and distill down to exactly what feels right and the most crystal clear version of how you feel about the said subject. And my dad was a poet, and he would always say, and this is my favorite thing that he said, if only I had time to say less. And so, yeah, it always stuck with me. And that process of writing a TEDx talk distilled, a million words into a few thousand. And those sentences are like inscribed into my brain. And there are hundreds of sentences that have been built from that talk, many more talks or whatever, that are just like galvanized into my brain. And then when I'm in a scenario, it might be in the pub, might be wherever, somebody talks about a certain subject, that my mind will associate with one of those sentences or a paragraph of those sentences, and it just flies out.
Perfectly formed speech paragraph.
And that, as a communicator, which is a very important role, in my case, operating a zero waste restaurant, you need to be able to communicate that very well, very quickly, very clearly. It's a complex subject. You need to distill it into something that you understand, that people understand. So that was an amazing process of distillation, language, and, to yourself as much as to everyone else.
I found the same process, yeah. And as a storyteller, I really wanted there to be a beginning, middle, and end, and themes and tropes and something that carried as a thread line through the story. Because for me, it was also, you've done so much, but for me, I was 29. I literally, when they asked me to do it, I said, what do you want me to talk about? I don't feel like I've reached that point in my career in advertising where I can say, this is how we change advertising, or some kind of very TED thing. I said, I literally only have the anecdotal stories of my life, and I'm still on that journey. And they were like, great. Yeah, like distilling that into something that felt like an interesting takeaway, which is the TED point, was very much an interesting challenge. And I do, those sentences live rent-free in my mind, and I pull them out at totally different times, and different paragraphs have become different workshops, have become different threads of ideas, have become all sorts of different things. And this podcast is very much the evolution of that TEDx that I did in 2019.
And post your TED talk, is it giving you confidence do you intuit a feeling in your chest that's like, this is a feeling that I want to express verbally? Have you ever fluffed a public presentation, whether it's big or small? Have you ever gone, that was a disaster? Getting into flow state, which something hopefully we can talk about, happens quite regularly because you've got this relationship between mastery of a subject. Hopefully we're talking about the things that we're experts of.
Yes.
And the high stakes of the scenario, is this beautiful combination that puts us into flow. And so most of the talks are great because you do get into flow. But then there's been some absolute shockers in my personal experience, some absolute shockers that crush you, this wave of pressure. And I once spoke in front of 1,000 people, and the audio was really bad and no one could hear me. And as I was speaking, I could hear the waves of the audience just start to get louder and louder and louder.
As they talked among themselves, basically.
As they started, and it got louder, and I just crumbled into dust, and just internally there was just nothing left. I was so distraught, and I just wanted to go home and cry myself to sleep. It was so bad. And that's probably happened about 10 times.
For me, because I'm so nervous about them, and I've had under 10 large public speaking engagements to over 1,000 people. So under 10. Yeah. So I over prepare. That was my default with the TED and with every other large speaking thing I've done. I over prepare so much because I think I listened to some YouTube video that was 200 hours. It's 10 hours per minute or whatever it is for a 20-minute talk, 200 hours. And if you really do practice it that much, it reaches a point where you just know it back to front, upside down. You could start at any point and you'd be fine. And the comfort in knowing that is so reassuring. And when I went out on that TEDx stage, what's crazy is that my brain was talking to me in overdrive. It was like, don't mess this up. Okay, this is where you stand. This is what you need to do. This is what you're thinking about. Know that it's this long. That's where the counter is. And my mouth was talking. I was already 2 minutes into my speech, and my brain and my mouth were not at the same place. I was talking to myself and listening to myself talk in my head whilst giving my speech. So if I didn't know it, I would have been messed up. But what then happened was, after about 5 minutes, my brain and my body eventually caught up to each other, and I was present and in the moment and speaking to people, and very much that eye contact was key.
If I'm speaking in a room of people and there's somebody that intimidates me in that room, and if I get in my own head, if the neurosis emerges because of the intimidating force in the room, game over. game over. It could just be one person that I'm then on stage thinking about what they're thinking about what I'm saying as I'm saying it. Game over. Can't do a good speech.
Takes you out of presence.
Yeah.
Well, we've obviously massively digressed,
Yes.
which is totally fine.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to say, hi, Douglas.
Hello.
It's a real joy to have you here in the studio.
I'm really chuffed to be here.
You are a pioneering British chef, renowned for championing sustainable dining. Your culinary journey includes tenures at esteemed establishments such as St. John, which is one of my favorite restaurants of my partner, The Fat Duck, and Noma. In 2014, you created Silo, the world's first zero-waste restaurant, initially established in Brighton and later relocated to London's Hackney Wick. Silo operates on a pre-industrial food system, utilizing techniques like fermentation, pickling, and preservation to ensure every ingredient is fully utilized. Your innovative approach has earned Silo accolades, such as Britain's most ethical restaurant and Britain's most innovative restaurant. Beyond the kitchen, you share philosophy through public speaking, including the TEDx we just talked about, which was called Waste is a Failure of Our Imagination, and contribute as a faculty member at the MAD Academy, a global food community inspiring the future culinary leaders to rethink systems and sustainability. It's so impressive what you've done, and I'm so excited. Where did this all start? Because I'm really curious about context and where people's journeys begin. And I think it's kind of integral to understand and know a person. So where were you raised, by whom, and what were your earliest memories that made an impression on you?
To explain how I came to open a restaurant that doesn't have a bin, it would be an unclear story to say that it started in kitchens, because it definitely started from childhood. I spent a lot of time thinking about psychology and understanding how motivations from childhood are so essential to climbing a mountain that is innovating Silo. Not having a bin in this current world is a very challenging project, and I've a good degree of rigor and hard work in me to kind of commit to a very, very challenging project. And that comes, I think, from witnessing my parents. We're sort of working class northern town in which we didn't have a lot of money, didn't have sort of electricity until I was 12. And my mum worked extremely hard, was maybe quite absent in a lot of my childhood. And sometimes when a parent is absent, the child thinks that they've done something wrong, and there is this innate sense of not being full, not being good enough. You know, that is basic child psychology. There was a lack of physical attention, physical affection, because they were surviving. They were in survival mode. I loved my parents so much and wouldn't change anything for the world. But there was an absence, and that has had a significant implication on me as an individual. This feeling, the innate feeling, as much as I can be cognizant of this truth, it's still there. And that is that I feel like I'm not good enough, or something's not right. Base experience, there's something unsafe about existing. And that is deep sort of rooted psychology in childhood dynamics. And that, you know, sounds terrible. And it is, I guess, tough.
So it's also fuel.
It's fuel, yeah. And this is why I will proudly speak about this, and understanding the fundamental challenges of innovating in this world. You have to be so dedicated. And that dedication can come from this innate desire to succeed and to fulfill an objective. So when I went to school, I was never recognized as neurodivergent. So I've never actually been diagnosed as ADHD or having dyslexia or dyscalculia and so on. But I definitely relate to almost all of those, including OCD and, you know, basically everything within that sphere of what we consider neurodivergent, and that was never recognized in school. So it kind of, this feeling of not being enough was exacerbated in a decade of being in school and terrified every day. I was terrified of the teacher asking, what is simultaneous equations, or what is 2 + 28 divided by 6? I was terrified of every class, and I would wear clothing that would make me less obvious, the most basic kind of expressions. I was basically trying to be invisible because I was afraid of that attention. And when every single day you feel like a failure, that builds a real kind of complex of, low self-esteem. So that's sort of was childhood. Suffered every day feeling that I wasn't worthy, I wasn't good enough, I was dumb. And so that is fuel, as you say, and that is incredibly notable in terms of how I got to the introduction that you've given me. That's the fuel, and that's important to point out. And I definitely wouldn't have achieved the nice things that you've listed there if it was not for that fuel. And there's just a bunch of great ideas that fuel has powered forward. But that's sort of how I see the successes that I have had.
With this tinge of, they come from a place of unworthiness.
Exactly.
And kitchens seem like an interesting space for a young person like that, because they're physical. You're not reliant on having to be incredibly academic, improve yourself. You're not, solving multiplications. It's somewhere that the harder you work, and tell me if I'm wrong, but the harder that you work, the further that you get, the more hours that you're willing to put in. And so how did you even find out that kitchens were an option?
When you're not academic, it really narrows the search of what you can become. And it was serendipitous in that I remember going to a really, really, really awful hotel restaurant. And there was a guy, and I didn't know it was awful at the time, but the food was all frozen in plastic bags and put into a microwave. And that's what I mean by awful. But at the time, I didn't know that was bad or good. And there was a guy who I really looked up to, who's just like the older, cool kid, who I remember was very nice to me. He was part of this cool crowd, and I just remember him being nice to me, and that wasn't always common. Kids can be quite harsh, so somebody showing a bit of compassion, lights you up. And he was a chef in that kitchen, and I just remember thinking, there's a pathway that I could probably do. I could probably go into that kitchen, and this awful landscape of academia, I don't think is going to affect me getting into that kitchen. And just applied to be a kitchen porter, a pot wash. And when I was 16, 17 and rapidly falling out of school. And I just got into that kitchen and fell in love, not with cooking, because there was very little cooking going on there. It was more the environment, which I think anything that wasn't academia, I would have fallen in love with at that point. And kitchens are a bit like pirate ships. There is this kind of lawlessness. There are rules and there are systems in place that you have to sort of honor, but there's an anti-authoritarian approach to everything, and certainly that kitchen, and actually all the kitchens that I've worked for. And a lot of chefs are people. There's a lot of neurodivergent individuals in kitchens because of that same reason, because academia just, didn't suit them, and they might or might not have been recognized as their brains working differently. And kitchens just unconsciously or consciously seem quite appealing to non-academics. So this silo now is probably 95% neurodivergent, which is interesting. But that's how I got into kitchens at that time.
And then, as you describe it, you kind of went on this gastronomic crusade as a pirate through many different kitchens and worked your way up and ended up traveling and went to Australia.
I remember before the crusade, I was working at St. John Bread and Wine, which is an amazing restaurant that practices nose-to-tail cooking in London. I remember that being so significant as a restaurant because what I was seeing in the restaurants I'd previously worked at, and these were like 2 Michelin Star restaurants, Michelin Star, like, these really fine dining establishments. And I went from this hotel kitchen that was, really not worth noting to 2 Michelin Star kitchens. I made that jump, and that jump was made because in the very limited knowledge that I had of gastronomy, you hear these chefs talking about Michelin stars and rosettes and stuff. And so I'd literally just thought, I'm going to aim for the top. And I aimed for the top because I felt at the bottom, like spiritually, I existed at the bottom ranks of society of the universe. I was in the gutter. So I thought, right, if I can aim for the top and just work harder than everyone, maybe that'll mean I will be less dumb and less
improve your
worthless.
Sense of self-worth as well,
exactly.
Right? I must be something if I'm here with the best of the best.
Yeah, exactly. And so I did. I went to a 2 Michelin Star kitchen as my first real job when I was 17, 18. An awful experience. And then sort of bounced around a few of that sort of establishments, thinking that this was the place to be because it's on paper, these are the best. So, of course, I need to do this. And it was an awful reality. It was bullying and violence and everything wrong with the world in a kitchen. But I kind of thought, well, school was awful. This is awful. Maybe just life is awful.
Right.
And so, I was bouncing around these kitchens. And I remember this chef of mine who I also looked up to and respected. He went down to London to work at St. John. And he was telling me, this place is really good. You should consider it. And I remember looking at the St. John cookbook thinking, this is terrible. Because I was brainwashed in these Michelin Star kitchens to saying what is Michelin is the best. And I thought that, I drank the Kool-Aid. I thought, yep, okay, this is what's the best. And this guy, this chef Billy, he was like, no, I disagree. I think this is better. It's different, but better. And like telling me all these things about St. John, and I just didn't get it. And it only was because I really, really, really respected him that I took a kind of a gamble and moved to London from the north and worked at St. John Bread and Wine. I was 19 years old and I just didn't get it. I thought it was, the presentation of food was, beige, and it was just on a chipped white plate, and it was food on toast, and there was no kind of fancy, trickery. I don't get why Billy and a lot of people are saying that this place is special. It probably took a year for the penny to drop. And eventually when it dropped, it really was this huge revelation. I guess, retrospectively from an artistic point of view, my dad was a poet and a painter, and he was an abstract thinker, abstract guy. And that is very much part of me. And I think St. John was a kind of catalyst to start thinking like my dad was thinking, and in these creative ways. And I realized that St. John was pioneering a philosophy. They believed in something that wasn't just mimicking other restaurants. And that's what happens in human societies, is that we iterate and we mimic, and we see the trends of things and we think, okay, well, we're going to go with the trend because that, for whatever reason, is working. And so chefs imitate chefs that are trending or like successful, and then you just kind of get this homogenous society of things. Whereas St. John was like, no, we believe that we have this philosophy that this makes more sense than what everybody else is preaching and practicing, and it's risky to stand out and to diverge from the pack. You're stepping aside and saying, no, this is a different expression. This is a different way of being a restaurant. This is a different way of cooking. This is a different way of seeing our relationship to food. And I didn't get it because I was, part of the marching crew towards, this superficial
success of Michelin stars and.
Exactly. And it took a long while to realize that what they were talking about was so healthy. Not only was the kitchens a healthy work environment, psychologically, emotionally, the cooking was healthy. It was thinking outside the box about, just eating the fillet and, it doesn't make sense. All these other cuts are equally or more delicious, but everyone else is saying that the fillet was the best bit, and it's like, no, it's not. This is all the best bit. The whole animal is the best bit, and that was their specific way of seeing,
That was
food.
the philosophy.
Yeah, it was definitely more than
Nose to
like
tail.
nose to tail, but the entire restaurant stripped itself of frivolous, ornate items that were kind of expensive and superficial and
Superfluous.
Yeah, and it just stripped all that fluff away from the restaurant experience, and it was stark and not necessary for everyone, and that's fine, that's subjective, but what they were doing stood out so much, and it just had such a profound impact on me. Really changed who I was, and I felt different and better. I was like, this is like a massive upgrade of how I feel. Like whatever they're connected to, I'm now connecting to, and it feels like a relief in some way. And so I started thinking, well, they're thinking differently. What other restaurants are thinking differently? And then I looked around the world at restaurants that were thinking differently, and I went to them, whether that was in England, the Fat Duck, whether that was in Copenhagen, Noma. And it was just, I'm going to go around the world, and I'm going to go on this pilgrimage to all these places that are thinking differently, because thinking differently now at St. John's making me feel more whole. I was tapped into this mainstream consciousness that made me feel empty. And now I'm like feeling something. I'm starting to feel alive for the first time.
That purpose.
Exactly. It was like there was this void, and it was always there, and I felt empty. And then St. John's started to tickle that a little bit and like fill it in a little bit. And I was like, this feels good. This is like a relief. It satiated this feeling of dread. And so I went to fill that void in even more. And the idea was, these restaurants that stood out and were thinking differently would maybe fill that gap.
At what point were you starting to figure out the thread line of these restaurants, and the things that I'm finding most interesting is around sustainability and waste? And because I think it would be very unusual for a cook to notice in the way that you started to notice how much plastic waste was being used, how much things were being thrown away.
That expression, like, art is the hammer that smashes the mirror of reality. And St. John was like a little in the mirror, and it kind of cracked. And, what I was seeing as the world through that mirror was starting to crack. And there were these other and then the big absolute blow that destroyed my perception of reality was an artist called Joost Bakker. Tall, beautiful, Dutch-born Australian dude, absolute genius, an extraordinary mind. He has what I've sort of understood as somebody who's held on to that childlike curiosity about the world. His power is that he's not influenced. We're all unconsciously and consciously influenced by our peers, the world, advertisement, things we read, things we watch on YouTube. That's all influencing our perception of the world. And I think what he was incredibly resilient to the influence of outside stimulus, and he managed to keep this childlike curiosity of wonder and awe. And he's a very smart, very factually, he can reel off all these statistics, and it's just like extraordinary. But he yet has this like, what if this, what if that questions, doesn't take what people tell him as like, this is a factual, this is how I need to adopt this information. He's like, no, that's not for me. No, that's not for me. And parries all of that away, and then just thinks clearly. And I think that is probably a common denominator with a lot of real innovators. And so Joost, I met Joost in Sydney in 2011, and I was working at one of these holier-than-thou temples, the top of the pyramid of food excellence, apparently, considered one of the world's best restaurants. And it was a sin. This restaurant was, if nature had the world's 50 best restaurants, I guarantee our 50 best world restaurants would be at the bottom of nature's 50 best world restaurants. And so for those maybe listeners who have not heard of the world's 50 best restaurants, that's a guide, like the Michelin guide. And so there's this 50 best restaurants in the world, and I'd worked in a lot of them. I'd worked in 15 of the world's 50 best restaurants, at that time doing stages. So I really knew what those restaurants looked like. And I think a lot about nature, as in like, what does nature want? You know, if we're going to talk about in a moment, maybe it's what sustainability really is. We can't think about that without thinking about what nature wants. But to digress, we used to fill a skip of food waste every day.
Wow.
A skip. And this was not just food waste, this was the best produce in the world. It was in Sydney, and we were getting produce from biodynamic farms in the Blue Mountains and some of the best seafood. It was extraordinary. And it was probably maximizing 30% of everything that was being purchased. Everything coming through that front door was only 30%. There was 70% waste going into a skip. Not compost, just like with all the plastic and everything. It was a real sin from the perspective of nature. And that at the time was
standard practice.
Yeah. It was like, yep, this is what the world is. This is how it is. This is excellence. And so in that kitchen, I was a bit of a rebel because I'd worked at St. John, and I was like, this is
taking things out of the bin, being like, maybe we could use this.
Yeah. And one day I got into a scrap with the sous chef, and there was a whole incident with quails and an altercation that led to me being asked to leave politely. They couldn't fire me because it was complicated. But yeah, no, I chose to walk out that day. And as if by some force of cosmic serendipity, there was this building made out of waste materials that was designed to be an ecosystem, designed by Joost Bakker, this genius designer. And there was this loud music playing, and it was long snaking queue of people queuing in this tropical rain. It was very vivid memory. And I remember like getting into this building, I could feel my heart beating, and I knew, and this is not being hyperbolic, that this was going to be the rest of my life. I absolutely was so sure that whatever this was going to be the rest of my life. I think I was quite emotional. I was quite existential about this whole industry and this experience, and just being like down and out in Sydney, and just like kind of giving up on this idea of hospitality. And I was just in this building and like, I don't know what this is, but I love it. I love it so much. And there were chefs sat down with customers, you know, there was no windows because they didn't have time to build windows because it was a temporary building for a food and wine festival. There was a beehive on the roof. There was hundreds of different plants hanging over the ceiling in these old barrels, and there was this weird machine, like cylindrical auger spinning around outside, and it was this prophetic inscriptions of thoughts painted all over the ceiling and the walls, and the food was served in the glasses with like jam jars and recycled wine bottles, and the tables were propagated with a keg system, and there was pouring wine from the table, from these kind of wires coming out from under the table into jam jars, and there was wine coming out of kegs, and I'd never seen anything like it. And it was such an abstraction from what I understood, and it was that hammer that smashes the mirror of reality for me. It really changed me fundamentally. And yeah, it's just this feeling more than anything that I knew that this was going to be the rest of my life. And it's never more true than today.
Wow. What an experience. And I can imagine you going in there and being like, wow, this is visually overstimulating. It sounds like everything everywhere all at once.
Yeah.
When did you actually meet Joost, and what was your first initial conversation with him?
So I don't remember the first meeting, but I remember the first memorable bit was him within a very short span of knowing me. It might have been the same day. I can't remember if I'd returned the next day, but I do remember him towering over me. He's really, really tall and very like intimidating. And I was terrified. You know, we talk about public speaking, like I wouldn't want him in the audience. You know, he's very intimidating. I remember him towering over me and just saying like, oh, you know, got this opportunity to build this same thing in London. Do you want to be the head chef?
Just like that.
He just had this instinct that I was going to be significant in his, project, in his vision of the future, which is right. I think he was right, because we're still very, very close friends 14 years later, and he's coming over in a few months to celebrate 10 years of Silo in the UK. So yeah, he's a very significant figure, and I just have a very vivid memory of him saying, "Do you want to be the head chef?" Just seeing something in me that people had never seen in me. Like, everybody treated me badly in these kitchens. It was an awful existence in those sorts of kitchens. Everyone bullies each other, and then again, school was probably worse than that. So, when you had this amazing artist saying, "Do you want to be the head chef?" Like, having so much faith in you.
Yeah, you felt chosen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That little boy was like, yeah, I'm worthy.
Exactly.
So I actually don't have a sponsor, and there aren't any commercial breaks in this season. Instead, I wanted to use this little pause to say how much we would love to hear from you. We want to get to know our audience better. There are lots of different ways to practice slowing down, and lots of different people and stories we can hear from. So please leave a comment or a review on this episode to share your thoughts. Tools you use to slow down, someone you'd like to suggest for the show, or just your thoughts on the episode. This really helps us plan future episodes and cover things that you might be interested in. Now, back to the show.
I do want to switch into the sustainability questions. And there's a Desmond Tutu quote that you give in your TEDx, which is, "There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in." So where do you think this starts?
Yeah, I mean, that is the best description of Silo. That is that also opens the book, the Silo book. That's the first quote. It's so profound to me, in that if we deal with sustainability on the surface, we're just going to keep putting plasters on things that are just going to keep happening. We're never going to solve the root cause of the problem. We need to go upstream. We need to find out why waste exists, where that waste's coming from, why it exists, and how do we get rid of it? How is waste related to sustainability? What are those relationships? And so fundamentally, that is the story of Silo in a kind of post-meeting Yoast mentality of a
post-Yoast
mentality. I started having these glitches. I started seeing things. I really,
through the matrix. Yeah.
Genuinely, there was glitches in the matrix, and I did start seeing things, and I just questioned everything. Everything started to unravel in ways that the more it unraveled, the more that void disappeared. And I know this is going to sound ridiculous to so many people, but it is so true, and gave an enormous amount of clarity to what is on the horizon. And I've never, ever, ever wavered, and will never waver from moving towards that thing on the horizon. And the first, the first vision was this bin in a jungle. I was, so just to contextualize that a bit, I was in a cafe that Yoast had bought in Melbourne, or got a lease on or whatever. And he said, right, before we do London, we're going to start by, this little cafe, and we're not going to have a bin. All credit to Yoast. He had a building made of waste, and he had a bin in it. And he was like, this is a paradox. This doesn't make sense. There's a bin in this zero waste aspirational project. And so let's really hunker down and figure out how to not have a bin. And so he's from Melbourne, even though that project was in Sydney where we met. And so wind the clock forward 7 or 8 months, we got this lease on this tiny little cafe, stuck me in as the leader, just literally dunk. And Doug, we're not going to have a bin. We're going to call it Silo. So Silo actually started in Melbourne.
And what did that mean? Silo means?
So silo is an industrial vessel in which a material lives in it until it's the next phase of its journey, its next life. So water, before it's irrigation, wheat before it goes to the mill as flour. So it's holding a singular material on a journey. associated with industrial agriculture predominantly. And there's a lot of sort of fun paradoxical kind of nods to industrialization with silo. But silo in our interpretation was like an entire ecosystem in a silo. Which would be a restaurant. But yeah, so I was in this little cafe, and one night I was making shortbread and milled the flour because Yo said to me, right, we can only work with farmers because they're the people that will be able to give us food unpackaged.
The raw material as well, yeah.
Yeah, because food's all packaged. We need a bin to have pre-processed food because pre-processed food is wrapped in plastic. So to not have a bin, we need to deal in unprocessed food directly from its origin. And so we're going to work with farmers. We're going to get wheat. Like wheat would just come in a reusable sack or just a paper bag that could be turned into compost. Cream would come in a stainless steel pail directly from a dairy farmer, in which we could churn the cream into butter. And that one fateful evening, it was a Monday night in Melbourne in 2012, and I was blagging so hard. He was talking about all these stuff that I couldn't understand. He was talking about sustainability. I didn't know what sustainability meant. Talking about zero waste, no idea what that meant. I was clueless. But again, this energy was just making me basically blag. I was like, yeah. He kept talking about fermentation. I was like, I have no idea what fermentation is. No idea. Chefs didn't talk about fermentation. Right. Maybe bakers. But so I just kept saying, yeah, no worries. And I was like, okay, now I need to figure out how to do all this stuff.
You're Googling late at night.
Yeah. And so I was like, right, I've got this whole wheat. He's put this flour mill in here. I need to learn how to mill flour. And so there's dust clouds of flour everywhere and buttermilk slapping up against the ceilings because I was spinning cream in a mixer and buttermilk everywhere, and it was a disaster. And I remember like deep into the night, and I was drinking wine from a tap because we had this like keg system with all the beautiful wine from the Yarra Valley, and drinking wine and having a grand old time. And eventually made this shortbread out of freshly milled flour and cream that had been cultured first and then churned into butter, and then made shortbread from amazing cultured butter that the animals were from these regenerative farms. That wasn't a phrase then, but they were biodynamic and different natural farming systems in which the cows were grazing on natural pastures, and the wheat was from a biodynamic farm, and then it's freshly milled. And eventually, deep into the night, I tasted this shortbread, and it was this revelation, first of flavor. And the revelation led to this, huge glitch in the matrix, huge, massive. Eating this shortbread that looked different, very different, smelled massively different. I eventually ate this shortbread, and I'd made thousands of shortbreads at St. John, because that's always on the menu. So I knew what shortbread was. I can make it blindfolded. I couldn't mill flour blindfolded or churn butter, but eventually had this shortbread, and it was like, so my mind is a busy place, and it's noisy, ADHD, chatter, and everything went silent. It was this silence, and it was this clarity, and everything started to make sense. And I thought, this shortbread is the most extraordinary shortbread I've ever tasted. And it made every other shortbread seem obsolete, and that we were trying to not have a bin, and I'm somehow making shortbread, and it's the future of food. Zero waste is the future of food. So like, this is a superior product, better than any shortbread in any 3 Michelin Star, world best restaurant. And I've done it by accident, trying to not have a bin. And like, what else is possible in this arena in which we're working directly with nature? Then that's when I just saw this bin in the jungle, and I'm working on a book. It's going to be called "There Is No Bin in the Jungle," and clearly and obviously there is no bin in the jungle. And zero waste just hit me like a thunderstrike. Waste is a human thing. We are the reason waste exists. We invented a bin as it's a symptom of a system that is out of balance with the natural world. Yeah. And that's what zero waste is. Zero waste is reconnecting with nature. And that's not everybody's interpretation of it, but like, true zero waste is not having a bin, because nature doesn't have a bin, and we're aspiring to recalibrate and reconnect to the natural world, because we can never talk seriously about sustainability until we recalibrate with nature. And so, yeah, that was that bin in the jungle that created a landslide of seeing everything differently and feeling very, very differently, and that void disappearing.
Wow. And also the imagination that you have to create some of the things, both on the silo menu, but then also the plates that are made out of certain things, all kinds of different design features, all now makes a lot more sense. Because when you have this premise, this almost kind of artistic premise of no bin, there's so many different ways that you can go from that. And when you're given a raw ingredient, your brain probably goes, well, there's a million different things that we could do here. I would just love for you to give one recent example at Silo of an ingredient that has come in through your doors and what you've been able to do with it.
Sure. If I may use a non-edible material as the example, because it was last week. One of the materials incongruous with the system. So just to very briefly describe the system of not having a bin, let's say 95% of what would necessitate a bin, and we're talking about general waste bin, the bad bin, is solved just by what Joost suggested 14 years ago. Get everything from nature in package-free and reusable vessels up and down the supply chain. Biodegradable materials are okay if we're going to compost those biodegradable materials like paper. So it's coming directly from nature in package-free vessels. And then as chefs or as bartenders or as baristas, we want to maximize those resources. Can we use 99% of everything? That's the goal. And then finally, that 1%, or if less successfully, there's 20% or 30% food waste, material waste, from the system. Then let's make sure that it's all compostable. So then we can compost it, and then it goes back up the supply chain. As the farmers may come to the restaurant with the produce, we can give them compost to go back up the supply chain and fertilize and feed the soil that will in turn become food to then come back down the supply chain.
And you're able to find everything that you need locally and within the UK. There's not like a drink ingredient that you're like, oh, we really want this, but we can't get it.
This is where I try and point out 95%, because we give ourselves, there's all kinds of things like, where do the light bulbs come from? Where do the pens come from? There's this 5% of discrepancy that's always good to give ourselves. And there's an enormous amount of innovation on that 5% that we can talk about. But that 95% of designing out the bin is just simply working in a pre-industrial food system. It's recognizing that waste comes from industrialization. So industrialization being the umbrella over things like supermarkets, plastic, polystyrene, pollution, air miles, road miles, monocultures, glyphosate, these chemicals that we're relying on to fertilize or to resist certain weeds and pests within agriculture. That's killing the soil, killing the biodiversity, the systems in which just destroy nature. Industrialism is literally a force that is destroying nature. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Industrialism is a word that pertains to scale. And that's not evil. There's nothing wrong with scaling something big or small. There's lots of great examples of good industrialism. But in the general sense, the umbrella of industrialization I'm using to highlight that system that is industrial, that is not listening to nature, is absolutely working against nature, 100%. So within that system, we have wine bottles coming from amazing vineyards in as far as Italy. And we love wine, natural wine, amazing circular viticulture. We love that. We want to work with these small producers that are working with nature to create incredible wine, and that is not that popular in the UK. There's some, but not enough to fulfill a wine list. We want to have 20 plus of these wines because people have different tastes and we want to satisfy that. So we have these wine bottles flowing in from all these different logistical supply chains around Europe and coming in, and glass is a material that is incongruous with the overall system because it is not reusable. You might think you could reuse it, but it will not go back up that supply chain and be reused. They don't have the facilities to wash it or the supply chain to go back up. So it is not reusable, not in the hundreds of bottles. It is not biodegradable and it is not edible. All the materials flowing into silo are those three things: biodegradable, reusable, or edible. And so that was this kind of like enigma, this non-closed loop, which was just going to industrial recycling. So we innovated. We built a glass pottery in which we're turning all of our single-use glass into things that we need: tiles, ceramics, tableware, light fittings, sinks, all kinds of crazy stuff made from our wine bottles, even sand to make artificial beaches on the canal. We can make from our wine bottles. But then there's the cork in the wine bottle. And last week we innovated bread baskets. So bannetons is the French terminology. So when you make a sourdough, you put it into a basket to prove. We buy them from God knows where they're made. But yeah, we started making our own bespoke bread bannetons out of cork from the wine bottle. And so that was the most recent innovation that springs to mind, is making bread baskets from the wine bottle corks.
Wow. I mean, and the list is endless. And so I really wanted to just hold you to one example because there's so many. It's such an interesting paradox to me because every so often culture will provide us with another reminder of how incredibly high pressured and intense the environment of a fine dining kitchen is, whether it's Anthony Bourdain's book or Gordon Ramsay's show, or most recently The Bear. The restaurant world is depicted as fast-paced, grueling, emotionally battering. How do you kind of reconcile this idea of that world with the possibility of slowing down? Because I also think that our culture and economic society has set a certain standard of what it takes to be a successful restaurant. You need to sell a certain amount of food. You have to turn a certain amount of tables, has to be a certain price. There's an economics that is necessary for a restaurant to succeed. It can't just be a utopian dream. So how do you kind of reconcile these things of this restaurant needs to turn a profit, pay everybody's salaries and make sense with this kind of vision of the future? Yeah,
it's a brilliant question. It's a big one. I actually think that I want to point out something that maybe not everyone has thought of or aware of. It's through food industrialization, it has changed, radically changed our economy and our perception to what the value of food is. Culturally, like we were talking before the podcast outside about how in France they spend 40 to 50% of their annual income on food, whereas in England and Germany and other countries it's something like 12%. So different cultural approaches and value systems to food. But what industrialization has done, thinking about supermarkets, factory foods, processed foods,
brought the price right down.
It's brought the price down to an unnaturally low price point that is essentially a false cost. There's no such thing as cheap food. If it's cheap, for monetary reasons, it's not cheap on the environment. That energy is moved somewhere else.
Or on the people working there or something else.
Or slave labor, like cheap chocolate 100%. Is absolutely predicated on slave labor. And so there is no such thing as cheap food. Now, to bring it back to why restaurants are under so much pressure is that simply that unnaturally low price point of food that we're, acclimatized to bleeds into the entire food industry. We as a bakery, for instance, you couldn't sell a loaf of bread for £10. You just couldn't. And now if you want to pay the farmer properly and the farmer be on a living wage and the chefs are all on a living wage and, you're doing it properly, that's truly sustainable, then you're basically going to lose money. And so there's fundamentally compromises everywhere, and different chefs and restaurateurs and bakers and baristas compromise in different ways, but it's always compromise because we're under this enormous pressure to survive as people that are in this industry for whatever reason, providing a service. Silo could not sell a tasting menu for £200 a menu. We couldn't. And so how do we survive and demonstrate, that this is a food system for the future when we're under that enormous pressure? Now, silo has become popular because of zero waste, this idea, and it's me as a storyteller for the last 14 years. It's how do I tell a story to people that waste or zero waste is an appealing, attractive idea that we should take seriously. And so that has been my challenge. And that, from a business point of view, is how I survive. And survive is a key word because it's not necessarily thriving or flourishing economically, because that would be a lie. But surviving has become built on being a good storyteller. And these stories don't have to be false. These are real stories. Like, we're all born into a world that has a bin. And so we accept that the bin is part of life. And I'm just saying, no, the bin's just started to exist just before your grandparents. Like, this is a tiny blink of an eye in the scope of humans sort of post cooking food, post becoming Homo sapiens, a million years ago, a million and a bit years ago. Waste has just started to exist. And I'm just telling the story, and I think it definitely is a true story, that is as a problem. It represents being out of balance with nature. And the more bins and waste accrues, the more out of touch we are with the natural world. That's a good story. I'm fully behind that as truth. But that's a story that I need to tell really, really well to all of the employees, to the customers. And so survival for me and for Silo to just keep on surviving and demonstrating all these amazing innovations is to be a good storyteller and make clear to people why waste exists and why this zero waste system is the future of food. There's never a perfect day. Nothing's ever perfect, and that's fine. If we can be excellent most days, great, because we're trying to demonstrate that we can survive and be excellent at all these things. We're going to be excellent at each other. Like I'm going to be excellent to my employees. I'm not going to be perfect, but I'm going to be excellent. I'm going to treat them with dignity and respect. The customers that come in are going to have an excellent meal most of the time. I think it's important to be honest and real and not say it's always going to be perfect, because what a toxic world to live in. Like that's totally unnatural, because we're only dealing with small regenerative farmers. We're not making our team work more than 50 hours. We're being kind to each other rather than bullying each other to get the best results, So that world, this world of capitalism, this world that, is just like whipping, us into that shape, that particular shape. We're like, nah, we're tapping out. We are not part of this system. We will not behave in those ways. And it's really hard. It's really hard, but there's a lot of hidden values that help us stay alive. Over time, it's becoming more and more survivable. And, we're building a new system within the broken system that is our food system.
It's really incredible work. And I do see this wave, this kind of new movement that kind of budding and flourishing that hopefully can start to work in concert and support one another and create this whole new tide, as you say, from within. You're clearly passionate about this challenging work. And it can be, in many ways, you're an activist, an advocate of this thing, and that can be overwhelming and it can be challenging. What are the ways in which you slow down in your day-to-day on a micro level? Like everything we've said is very macro, it's very change the world. But in a day, if you're having a stressful time, what are your 3 ways to just like slow down?
I am in this perpetual survival mode in which I'm speeding up all the time, and it's bad. I'm bad. I only know how to survive because I've been surviving through school and through gastronomy. I'm in survival mode all the time and find it very difficult to slow down. I also have ADHD, so that's hard to slow down. I do have a couple of, when people say I found God, I have found nature. And what that means is I can find the present moment through nature. And I can't do it, unfortunately, on demand. But there has been a number of moments in my life where I've gone from, mostly in hyper-stressed scenarios, I've gone into nature just like through coincidence, not because I thought it would solve anything, and had this incredible feeling of all of the stress in the world disappears and being just like immediately brought into the present moment in these natural environments. So trips to like whiskey distilleries in Scotland, and I was driving for hours through this forest, and just these hours of recognizing the forest rather than recognizing kitchens in London. I just had this moment of like, oh my God. And I asked them to stop the car, and I literally crawled into this kind of pillowy pine forest where there was these like big fluffy pillows of like moss, and I crawled into it, and I was like digging my fingers into the soil, being like, it was just like this amazing feeling of being present, and all of the stress that I associate in every cell in my body just disappeared. And so there's been 2 or 3 of those experiences where I've been so connected to nature, and that's been a profound insight into being present and slowing down. I meditate every day. I do deep breathing every day. I religiously need to do that. Otherwise, I fall out of center. I don't know if it's a neurodivergent thing, but when I lose routine and when there's chaos, I just feel like there's something out of line with life and don't feel safe, don't feel comfortable. And through rigorous mindfulness, bring myself to center.
Those are all great ways. And nobody is perfect at this stuff, and we're all on a journey. My final question, which I ask all my guests, is if I had to watch one film or read one book or go and see one piece of art that would help me understand you better, what would it be?
There is a book called One Straw Revolution, Japanese farmer philosopher who believed in nature. He found nature and was a scientist that studied nature. And that book was as philosophical as it was inspirational from an environmental or ecological point of view. And Masanobu Fukuoka was a champion of an idea called like no work farming, in which he understood nature so much that he could just do these very small, pleasant things that connected nature in a way which popular life is called rewilding, and he understood how nature's all connected and just did these small interventions to bring nature together. And he was a rice farmer and demonstrated that how he sitting writing poetry can sit and slow down, write poetry, and his rice production was tenfold. That 10 times the team in his neighboring farms, he could outcompete them 10 times with 10 times less inputs just by understanding nature. And that's probably, what I would describe. And it gets pretty esoteric. It gets really esoteric. There's a lot of existential philosophy, and it is, it's always just trying to have a very clear perspective from which we can design from.
That sounds like the perfect book to get a sense and a window into your mind. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me, and please help me slow down.
Yes, I will try. I mean, I'm also on the journey too, and I can't wait to come to Silo. I'm really excited.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for tuning in. This episode was hosted and created by me, Tiana Tambridge. It was produced by Whitney Rosenthal. Sound and video recording, mixing, editing and mastering is by Brazen Studios. Cover art designed by Natalia Ruche. Please subscribe to The Slowdown to be notified of upcoming episodes, tell a friend and leave a review, because it really helps a new podcast like this get out there into the world. And remember, we're all heading to the same destination, and there is no prize for getting there early, so we might as well slow down.